lot of what we know is informed by the media. For example, I've never visited the Middle East, I've never attended a G20 summit, but yet I have opinions on those, and I know those, the information I have, from what the media feeds me. This is the case in relation to the growth and evolution of Indigenous arts in Canada since the 1960s. The media has changed drastically, of course, in the 21st century with the internet and access to information increasing widely. But I'm really most concerned today for this essay about print media when considering Anishinaabe artist Norval Morrisseau, who's from northwestern Ontario. He was born in 1931 at Sandy Lake First Nation. And I'm today going to focus on his framing in the 1970s. But this talk will recognize that his framing went on from the beginnings when he had his first exhibition in Toronto in 1962 up until his retrospective exhibition at the National Gallery, the first Indigenous artist to have a retrospective at the National Gallery in 2006. So he's a pretty important guy. But coverage of Morrisseau's life by the media has been relentless since he first entered mainstream art world with his exhibition at the Pollock Gallery in Toronto in '62. An ongoing interest in his career and his personal struggles has left the media with a keen interest of him. In fact, since he's passed on in 2007, media coverage hasn't dissipated. In fact, it's been ramped up because there has been ongoing issues related to copyright and also forgery rings, which spices up things for the press. So Morrisseau was a novelty who became a spectacle, and my research into the mythology of Morrisseau really is a step removed from a biographical study of, or an art historical biographical study of the artist. Instead, I'm more interested in the myth that surrounds Morrisseau. Some people have a very close relationship with the artist, and so they have different ways of thinking about Morrisseau than I am proposing here, and that's fine. Some people think of Morrisseau as a pretty despicable person, and Picasso was a despicable guy, but everybody talks about what a great artist he was. Sadly, most people seem to focus on Morrisseau's behavior. It trumps his art historical credibility. And why is this? His work is really important to Canadian art history, and I believe that part of my research is to make sure that change occurs in thinking. So in 1979, Christopher Hume wrote in Maclean's magazine, "Nobody enjoys Morrisseau more than Morrisseau. When he talks, others listen. Where he goes, people follow." He was a really magnetic person, and his personality was as large as some of his canvases. He exerted an identity that was fueled through media interest, and trying to pin him down is complicated in Canada's colonial need to essentialize him within a narrow but bifurcated roles assigned within stereotypical framings of racialized identity. Press reports comprised of interviews and quotes by gallery dealers, art critics, columnists, concerned citizens complicate his image. And while the press and the art world attempted to figure him out, Morrisseau began to exert his own influence, fashioning a persona, and at times soberly resisting the media's attempt to defeat his so-called demons. This is a photo of Morrisseau in 1975 at an art exhibition he had in downtown Toronto. So you get a sense of his work here a little bit, but also from that flamboyant shirt, you get a sense of his personality, I think. Canada's media fixated on Morrisseau on behavior, serving him up as a model in its efforts to both discipline Indigenous bodies and teach Canadians about Indigenous peoples. And his behavior then, more than his art, has represented the confining narratives with little space for consideration of his art outside of that. Morrisseau's resistance to this constructed racial fixity that was imposed by Canada redirects this discourse. And today I'd like to tell you about some of his efforts and his agency in this dance that occurred in the 1970s. Disciplinary actions and performative imperatives confine notions of race, of course, but he struggled against that subjection. Morisseau attempted to forge a new mode of identity and challenge these essentialized claims, not always that successfully, but this theoretical direction is examined throughout the study that Dr. Pete mentioned that I've just completed on Morisseau and sent off, hopefully, for publication. Nadine Ayers, in Racial Imperatives, used the term racial discipline to describe a network of relations that together formulate racial identity. And I see this as informing this particular study. Why isn't that coming up? This is changing from Mac to IBM, excuse me. There should be a painting of Morrisseau from 1972. It was in the Group of Seven show, or the professional Native Indian artists exhibition that was at the Mackenzie in the fall. It was the first image that you saw, so sorry about that. His range of subject matter has often been characterized as painting myths or legends. And actually, he did paint many interesting images in that case, as is seen in Mishipishu here, but he also pushed the boundaries of that art in new ways. But yet, while his canvases were really interesting, it was his unruly behavior that the press focused on. So here's an example of the kinds of reportage that was in the press. This is from 1972. When a Toronto Star staff writer, Wayne Edmonston, pronounced after the headline, "Indian artist clings to legend," as if, you know, he had nothing left to hold on to. In a story that was related to a 10-year retrospective exhibition of Morisseau's work that was again mounted at the Pollock Gallery in Toronto, and it said that, quote, Morisseau had survived a decade of recognition by non-Indian public from whom he is almost wholly alienated, clinging to the mythical subjects of Indian legend, interpreting and at times involving his own persona in them. So, kind of weighty stuff. Terms such as survived, alienated, clinging signify morbidity, explaining that Canadians, quote, from whom he is almost wholly alienated, alerts the readers to his otherness, his exoticism, and his separation from mainstream Canadian art and society. The reporter goes on to claim the confusion, mistrust, and instinctive pride of an intelligent and talented man torn between two cultures. In Morisseau's case, not a cliche, but a fact, can be seen in his portraits. Not mentioned by the reporter is the fact that next to this image in the press was a painting that Morrisseau did of himself as Christ, which seemed to upset a lot of people. Gee, this is crazy. Here's an example of one of those paintings Morrisseau did of himself as Christ. And you can see that he has a very unusual way of painting. And while he was influenced by traditions, Anishinaabe traditions, his work is very unique. The use of color, the use of line is something that no one had ever done before in painting. Joan Sutton, also of the Toronto Star, a couple of years later, added to the behavioral picture that was painted of Morrisseau in the press, noting that the artist's visionary work emerges from the alcoholic haze that has clouded most of his life. Much of his work was inspired by his need for alcohol, end quote. People in the press weren't writing about other artists in that way. They were writing about Morrisseau like that monthly in the paper. And so that leads you to believe that this is a racial construction at work here. And it feeds into stereotypes, both negative and positive, of the shaman within a noble savage construction, and also of the violent, drunken Indian, which we saw often in the 70s, and we see morphing into new ways of thinking more recently. Still there, however. She said, but at the same time, Morrisseau, who was very frustrated with this sensationalization, actually spoke to this particular columnist who included his words in the column. And he said, I would think in terms of this many paintings means this much money, and I can go to Toronto and get drunk. Now that I've given up drinking, I'm filled with great peace. So he's trying to rectify that change. Gary Dalt in The Star as well used this sort of mythic language to describe Morrisseau. He's as big as Paul Bunyan, as moody as Clint Eastwood, as funny as Will Rogers, and as gentle as Uncle Remus. He's also as potentially dangerous as Charles Bronson, who used to be kind of a big deal in the 70s, end quote. This all adds up, according to Dalt of The Star, to his being a visionary artist. I'm not sure. Checking his math, readers might question his conclusion. Uncle Remus was a politically incorrect fictional former slave character who, in a Gula patois, told Aesop's-like fables and was considered both endearing but mostly laughable, while characters such as Eastwood and Bronson were highly violent killers at the time. So promoting both endearing and violent aspects in popular culture, in the end, Dalt confirms that Morrisseau is a brilliant painter. Again, it just doesn't add up. Not everybody was considering Morrisseau this way, though. Time magazine, for example, had been very positive in its support of Morrisseau, and in 1975, it celebrated his 5th and best show at the Pollock, it considered, by acknowledging the rocky road he'd traveled in the past 13 years. They said, Morrisseau met with public success and private angst. The article explains that Morrisseau was recognized that in 1962, those that bought his art, quote, thought I was a bush Indian, a savage. So does a savage really intuit these things and speak back to the press? Once again, we find evidence of Morrisseau's acknowledgement and critique of these confining tropes assigned to Indigenous people. He did that as well in his art, and this is one of my favorite pieces from the 1970s. It was also in the 7th show at the Mackenzie in the fall, and it's a story of colonialism, the gift being both Christianity and being smallpox. So the Winnipeg Free Press also liked to play a lot with Morrisseau because Morrisseau spent a lot of time in Winnipeg. And they were trying to give readers a sense of who he was in a feature article that was titled, Indian Artist is Wedged Between Two Cultures, admitting that he, quote, is rated by many as the greatest living artist, Indian or otherwise. Reporter Bill Holdman submits his influence has been indisputable and profound. Great. He notes that Morrisseau's works have been sold for as much as $7,000 or for as little as the price of a cheap bottle of wine, end quote. Explaining that his annual income hovers around $40,000 to $50,000, a friend added in the article, in a good year, he's probably making $100,000. He could easily be a millionaire if he wanted to, or if he had the right agent, end quote. But the report confirms that Morrisseau doesn't care about money or possessions, quote from Morrisseau. I could make a lot of money if I wanted, but I don't want to now. Well, the article admits that experts say he will be remembered as one of Canada's greatest artists. It continues to assert that he's wedged uncomfortably in a space that he doesn't quite fit. They use a quote from his gallery dealer, Jack Pollock, as saying, quote, with the exception of 2 weeks earlier this year, he's been off the bottle. I consider this a minor miracle. So even when there's a story that is promoting him as one of, quote, the greatest living Canadian artists, still it seems to always fall back into that stereotypical frame. The reporter concurs that Morrisseau, who he had seen walking around Winnipeg, appears calmer, quote, only the deep facial creases reveal his entanglements with booze and his periodic brushes with death, end quote. And the report concludes, although Morrisseau's art is bathed in sharp colors, the man remains distant, mysterious, and cloaked in shadows and dull grays. Yet while the reporter concludes that Morrisseau is mysterious, with only passing reference to his color palette, which is rich and exciting, he has offered a narrative of his life that appears more colorful than his work. This is another piece that he did in 1976, and again, these aren't really stories about legends, this stereotypical frame where Morrisseau's art is seen as primitive, focused on a frozen-in-time past. He's commenting on things that are going on at the time, and 1976 was a very explosive time in Canadian politics for land rights, as it is today. So this is ongoing. And Morrisseau is very aware of that, and we see in this very explosive picture this bifurcation of the painting itself with a shaman figure with youth sitting on his lap, punching out into the space where the Ottawa bureaucrats, one is a miner and one is a bureaucrat from the government, seem flummoxed by how to deal with these two clashing worldviews. And I think the use of color here really says a lot as well. The red, of course, is anger, and it's negative, and yet the blue is calming and tends to be more positive in art historical terms, at least. So it's a very sophisticated portrayal of contemporary times, yet nowhere in the press do you find essays about his contemporary connections to colonial identity. Okay, so disassembling and reassembling a visual autobiography. So throughout the 1960s, Morrisseau was asked again and again if he was a shaman, if he was a medicine man. He stepped away from that. He said, no, I'm a spiritual person, and he was a spiritual person. He'd been brought up by his grandparents, and his grandfather was a shaman within the Medewan spiritual tradition, and so he knew many of those stories. He knew much of that ceremony. He was stepping away from that to become an artist, however. But what became clear to him in the late 60s and in the early 70s, that he was being really framed within such a negative perspective in the press that one way to challenge that was to give the people what they want. And what they wanted was that stereotypical noble savage, wise sage. So Morrisseau remade himself as a shaman artist after spending the 1960s really not discussing that. And here we see a 1974 National Film Board of Canada presentation, The Paradox of Norval Morrisseau, which would take a whole nother day to discuss. But he does present himself in this still. He's discussing a vision quest that he took that is a very powerful scene in an otherwise highly problematic film. But with little understanding of Morrisseau's own performative efforts, Canadians observed his work within this confining frame of the noble savage. And he introduces an element of the ascribed stereotypical identity within his performative acts, in part to temper the disciplining force of the press and popular culture, and in part because of the challenge in trying to move outside that. Art historian and art theorist Craig Owens argues the subject, in this case Morrisseau, assumes a mask, here the shaman, in order to be seen, posing, quote, as an object in order to be a subject. And I think that's what Morrisseau begins to understand in the press and shifts his identity around that. So, in 1975, Morrisseau said in a Toronto Star essay that was titled, "A Ojibwe Artist May Soon Find He's Turning Into a Living Legend," Morrisseau spoke out. He said, "I'm tired of hearing about Norval the drunkard, Norval with a hangover, Norval in jail, Norval torn apart by his allegiance both to Christianity and the old Indian ways. They speak about this tortured man, Norval Morrisseau. I'm not tortured. I've had a marvelous time. When I was drinking, now that I'm not drinking, I've had a marvelous time in my life." In other words, butt out, talk about my art. And he says that a number of times to reporters. He said, talk about my art, don't talk about these other aspects. They're not important to me. So Morrisseau knew that his efforts to challenge the media construction had gone largely unnoticed, and it made good business sense as well to promote and embrace the brand of shamanism. That said, Morrisseau, an inherently spiritual man, as I mentioned, at the same time was exploring ways, personal ways, to reconcile a more authentic spiritual home that led him from Anishinaabe teachings through Christianity and eventually in 1976 to a spiritual group called Ekankar. It's been labeled as a cult. It's a conflation of spiritual teachings from the East and from the West, but for Morrisseau it was useful. It allowed for an integration of astral travel and transformation with enlightenment. And it really gave him a new direction to rethink the idea of shaman outside of cultural protocols. In 1975, Morrisseau painted a self-portrait that visually reframes himself as a shaman. So the vulnerability found in works in the 1960s have been replaced with an image of Morrisseau as shaman. This is a commissioned self-portrait by the McMichaels for the Kleinberg Gallery in Ontario, and these pieces were also in the 7 show at the Mackenzie in the fall. We see him wearing a beautifully ornate and colorful headdress. He's connected to nature, as was his interest. He signs his work, Copper Thunderbird, in pre-syllabics. And in this image, we see him command the attention as shaman. He also painted his wife and daughter as shamans as well. And he said in a dream he saw them this way. So this is sparkling, segmented patches of color that create a really convincing image to the spectator. That begins to shift the way the press thinks about Morrisseau as he reinforces these ideas again and again. Well, probably one of the most famous ways he reinforced the notion of being or becoming shaman, reassembling these ideas into his own way of thinking about shaman, was at a tea party that he held in the summer of 1978. And this is a tea party with fine English bone china, a silver tea set. Morrisseau had always been interested in royalty, and so he bought these things over the course of his career. And he wanted to make this, he said, as something that was like an everyday occurrence at Buckingham Palace. But on a reserve in northern Ontario, with 20-some guests flown in for an afternoon to have tea with the then famous artist in 1978, it had the makings of spectacle and makes for an opportunity to really consider the changing racial identity. It was thrown by Morrisseau on June 25th at his home reserve in Beardmore, and it conflates two very seemingly disparate traditions, a fascination with royalty and his shamanism. And he brings that together at this tea party. It involved the serving of tea, but also smudging, a ceremony that welcomed guests, and it repositioned him not as host, but as shaman here. He'd recently purchased a set of Royal Crown Derby china cup saucers and a complete sterling silver set, and he approached his art dealer, Jack Pollock, with his wish to host a garden party, quote, just as the Queen does in the grounds of Buckingham Palace, end quote. Pollock, who was eager to capitalize on any potential marketing ploy, supported his efforts and paid for the charter of the plane and invited potential collectors, people from the press, all to come. The event also included Anishinaabe curator Robert Huell, who today is a very famous artist, who at that time worked at Ottawa's Museum of Civilization, and different critics, and including his lawyer, Richard Baker, who shared some of the events of the day with me. So 24 people were shuttled to Beardsmore on a wartime DC-3 that Baker recalls was scary, loud, and uncomfortable. An old school bus picked them up at the airstrip and drove them to the backyard of Morrisseau's house on the res. And all of this was quite managed by Morrisseau, as you can see here. So he had drumming involved. Here's pictures of the events after tea has been eaten, watermelon eaten, and it was traditional blueberry tea that he served. And here are some examples, excuse me, of some of the people that, that took part in the event. This was packaged in the press as a shamanistic event. And Morrisseau more than happily played the role of the stereotypical shaman as part of that shift in manipulation of his own identity. Hey, it beat being called the quote-unquote drunk Indian every second week in the press. And it also helped to sell work. So Jack Pollock, who was the master of promoting Morrisseau's work, mentioned in the Globe and Mail the following day, quote, "Something spiritual happened." And here we see a photo of Morrisseau smudging. In 1979, Jack Pollock published a book, and he included the photographs I'm showing you here from the Tea Party as kind of evidence that Morrisseau was a quote-unquote authentic shaman figure. So passages that were in the Art of Norval Morrisseau book that explain this include such things as Morrisseau, artist, shaman, mystic, moves along with quiet dignity, meticulously observing the rituals of his glorious tribal past, left us with a feeling of awe and wonder. This confirms those stereotypical images that are part of that noble savage construction, but it also moves Morrisseau into a different realm. Pollock also described the events as something even Federico Fellini, an Italian director, couldn't have dreamed of. So here Morrisseau performed the role as sage shaman. To the delight of guests, Morrisseau included ceremony, indigenous practices, to shift the British tradition into something wholly unique. So, here's a couple of more photos from the event. They had a really good time. Beyond the tea service and the fancy dress of invited guests, little that took place was like a garden party. From the setting of Morrisseau's backyard right through to the events that took place that we see happening in the 15 photos that document this is an opportunity to create this new identity and also to sell an image and art. From photographic images, most guests were dressed in garden clothes. As you can see, this gal here, she's one of the arts critics from the Globe and Mail, who in the 1960s was very scathing in her reviews of Morrisseau as a primitive artist. And Morrisseau, I think, is having a little bit of fun here with this silver tea set, feeding her tea. This is Morrisseau's brother, Wolfe Morrisseau, and you can see that the Morrisseau brothers are dressed in dramatically different fashion, the accoutrement of native identity as opposed to those who arrived at the event. I'm going to turn to this image. This is Robert Huell, who's helping Morrisseau prepare the smudge for the beginning of this event. But Huell, who is a Cree artist, is not dressed and is not being read as Indigenous here. He's in a three-piece suit. He even has a carnation on his as a boutonniere. So he came representing Ottawa establishment, a museum, and so therefore he's seen as sort of an assimilated figure who later on changes that role dramatically. But in this image, he is in contradistinction to the way Morrisseau is trying to create himself. So a year later, Christopher Hume wrote about the garden party in a feature article in Maclean's magazine. He said, he exaggerated the events. He said that the attire was white glove and long dresses all the way. That wasn't really the case. Hume described the participants as passing a delightful afternoon quaffing exotic Ojibwe herbal teas and oranges injected with vodka. So it gives, again, it adds that layer of alcohol to the scene, but it was Jack Pollock who gave the participants oranges injected with vodka on the plane because he was afraid they needed to be subdued because it was such a scary plane ride. Anyways, these events loom large in Morrisseau's construction. In this magazine article, in Maclean's magazine, Hume finds Morrisseau's behavior captivating, celebrating his character for readers rather than moralizing directly as was more common in the press. He does mention his disregard for value of money. His wealth enables the entire community, Pollock is quoted as saying, as boozing for nothing, end quote. So although there is disciplining, there's a shift that occurs at this time. And by quote unquote bearing his loins to the sun goddess, end quote, and singing happy Indian songs, end quote, Morrisseau manipulates and confuses the roles assigned by essentialized tropes. He performs a shaman role, but he does so on his terms, and he demonstrates ambiguity and the arbitrariness of the sign Indian and the imaginary Indian. So what I hoped to bring across here to you today is that although the identity of Morrisseau, the mythology of Morrisseau was highly, highly manipulated and framed by the press, it wasn't a one-way street. Morrisseau too was working to challenge that identity. And I wanted to finish here with this image that Morrisseau painted in 1978. Storyteller, the artist, and his grandfather. And while we saw at the tea party an image of a very stereotypical type of shaman performing in a spectacle way, mostly in order to sell paintings, what we see in this beautiful diptych, an art historical term for the students in the class, is something very different. Morrisseau paints an homage to his grandfather, who, as I mentioned, was an important Medewan shaman. And we see him here surrounded by the spirit beings that envelop him. And he's painted on a background that is highly abstracted, but very calm and cool colors, and as he's enveloped in this scene. On the second canvas, we see the young man, Morrisseau, here as a young boy. And you can see that the color again shows his passion, his anger, his dealing with change. So he paints himself separate from his grandfather, even though he's had those stories and the benefit of that knowledge imparted to him, but he's taken a different path. He too considers himself a shaman. But he considers himself a shaman that's influenced by different directions. And we see that by the way these spirit beings come in from the top of the canvas and connect with him. But they do so from above, and they do so in a different way. Now, I don't know if you can see that here, but within one of these sort of spirit lines and bundles that Morrisseau often includes in his art is the term HU. And HU is a mantra of people in Kankar who use Hu as a way of meditating. So he is recognizing in this particular work that not only is he connected to his Anishinaabe spiritual traditions, but he is a shaman who's connected to other traditions as well. So here we don't see the stereotypical Morrisseau. We see an honest portrayal of a young identity, somebody who's growing into a new identity that's moving forward with a life, but at the same time respecting that tradition and honoring the history that his grandfather brings and has imparted to him. And I think that that's the kind of work that really needs to be done in relation to Morrisseau. Again, as I mentioned, a really important Canadian artist, not just a Canadian Indigenous artist. He actually, unlike the group of 7 who are thought of as creating Canadian identity, did paint in a new way of thinking that brings together Indigenous ways of understanding the visual with contemporary Canadian, American, and European traditions. But he does so on his own terms. He doesn't do it by following a movement that he sees coming out of New York, for example. And I think in that way, we really have to start reevaluating Morrisseau, and I hope this talk today helped to do that for you a little bit.